Hello, how's everyone doing today? I would like to talk about, I think, a very important issue, and that is voting. And is voting a violation of the non-aggression principle? Um, and I would argue that voting is not a violation of the non-aggression principle. Do I encourage people to vote? No. Do I think that voting has any effect? No. I think voting is largely a waste of time. Uh, I think voting isn't going to do anything. And I do think that uh, voting and encouraging people to vote is not only a waste of time, it's worse than not voting. Because one of the things you say when you vote is that the way to seek freedom is through the political process. And that is a very bad and misguided belief. So I think from a purely practical standpoint, you shouldn't vote. I don't encourage people to vote. I don't think voting is a good idea. I think it's ineffective. And you're wasting your energy. Every resource, all the money trying to get people elected in office is money not being used to achieve freedom in more effective ways. So I don't think that voting is something which is productive, but that's a separate question from, is voting itself violence? Now, saying voting is violence is very problematic because if you say that voting is an aggressive act, what you are really saying is it's okay for me to kill someone who votes. If I see someone walking outside the voting booth, I can shoot him. After all, if voting is violence, I'm simply using defensive violence. He started it by voting. You're allowed to use you're allowed to defend yourself against other people who violate the non-aggression principle. People can use fraud. You can use violence against them. People who steal, people who rape, people who murder. So if voting is truly against the non-aggression principle, what you are saying is it is okay to kill people who vote. You might not mean that. You might not want to say that. But if you truly believe it is, that's what you're saying at the end of the day. I also think that saying, now one of the reasons that people give for why voting is violence is saying, look at all the violent things the politicians are doing. Well, they got into office and people voted for them, and if people didn't vote for them, they wouldn't be in office, and therefore the people who put them in office are responsible, right? All the people who put Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, Obama, Lindsey Graham, you name it, all these people who put these people in office, if they weren't in office, they wouldn't be able to do these violent things, and therefore they are committing violence. And this, to me, is actually a very statist response. It's a statist belief, because the statist believes that government is simply representing the will of the people, or the will of the masses, that the politicians are simply doing what the voters want them to do. And the reason we have a government that we have isn't because it's coercive, it isn't because it's violence, they are simply representing the will of the people who voted for them. And when you make the same argument that you shouldn't vote because of that, you are agreeing with the status that government is simply representing the will of the masses. Where I believe that voting is a scam, that is nonsense. Why do people vote? Why does government encourage people to vote? And I believe that it has absolutely nothing to do with because they want to seek political office, right? As I believe it was Stalin who said, it doesn't matter who votes, it's who counts the votes. As Emma Goldman said, if voting made a difference, they make it illegal. So it has nothing to do with voting. If you don't vote, government exists. And if you vote, government exists. If you truly believe it's the voters who are responsible for the politicians, that means that if people stopped voting, government would cease to be. Do you really believe that? Sounds sort of crazy to me. No. So why do I believe that voting exists? Voting exists as a way to quell rebellion. Voting exists as a way for the government to basically say to people, you voted for me, therefore I am simply doing what you want, and you have no right to rebel against me. That's the point of voting. Voting is to delude people that they are in charge and they decide how government acts. So by having and if the masses believe that they govern instead of are being governed, they're less apt to rebel. That's one of the horrible things about democracy. One of the problems with democracy is that democratic societies, the people in the societies, are way more complicit. The biggest governments on earth and the most tyrannical governments on earth are democratic governments, because democratic governments have the least amount of rebellion. And the reason is because the masses are convinced that they are in charge and that government is just serving them, right? If it's a king or a dictatorship, they're more apt to rebel because there's no pretense that they're in charge, and therefore they're less likely to take take the leader's crap. But if they believe that they are in charge, they are less likely to rebel. So voting and the ballot is a very effective tool to get people to not rebel against you by convincing them that they are in charge, and that rebelling is really just fighting against themselves. But voting itself isn't violence. Simply putting someone on a ballot box isn't violence. And let me use other arguments. Let's say you vote for a candidate and he doesn't win. Have you committed violence? According to your own logic, you haven't. If the guy never actually seeks political office and never actually steals from people and never committed violence because he wasn't able to get enough votes, who did the voter hurt? If you vote for someone who never wins, obviously the people in the political office you're not responsible for, because you always vote for the losing candidate. So simply to say voting itself, not necessarily who you vote for, but simply voting for itself is an act of violence, clearly is inconsistent. If you vote for a guy who always loses. And there are certainly people who do, right? Simply putting a check marks next to a box isn't violence. It isn't violence. Another problem that I have with this view that voting is an act of violence is the idea that voting is an act of consent. And the only way you can consent to something is if you have the option to dissent, right? For instance, if a woman says you have to marry this guy or that guy, and you have to pick either one of them, well, you're not really choosing to be married, are you? The only way you can choose to have a government, even theoretically, is if you have the option to not choose a government. And to me, voting isn't choosing anything, right? A person who votes isn't saying, I want this guy to steal from someone and I want that guy to steal from someone necessarily. Sometimes voting could be, I'm choosing the least bad option. Let me give you an analogy of what I think voting is. Suppose you're walking down the street and two robbers come up to you with guns. And one says to you, give me $1 million or I'll shoot you. And the other one says, give me $1,000 or I'll shoot you. But we're nice robbers. We're going to let you vote on which one of us you want to be robbed from. And if you say neither, we will decide amongst ourselves or ask other people to decide instead. And you say, the guy who's going to rob me for $1,000, have you consented to be robbed? No, that's ridiculous. You're not consenting to anything. You're saying, I'd rather not be robbed. But if my choices are being robbed for $1,000 or being robbed for $1 million, if I have that choice, I'll choose the guy who's only going to rob me for $1,000. It's not consenting to anything. If a robber says to you, give me a $20 bill or a $10 bill, and you give him a 10, it's not consent. So saying that voting is consent is completely and utterly ridiculous. The only way voting could be consent is if you have if you don't vote, the result changes. But it doesn't. Many people don't vote. In fact, most people don't vote, and yet we still have a state. So if you truly believe that if the more people don't vote, there won't be a state, guess what? The majority of the population doesn't vote, and there is still a state. And they'll find some other way to justify why we have to rule over you. Now, I do believe that the fewer and fewer number of people who vote, the more obvious and the more ridiculous it is for the government to say they speak on behalf of the people, right? If 5 people out of a country of 300 million vote, then obviously it's a complete facade that they're voting, that they're reflective on the masses. But about 50% of the people eligible to vote don't vote. Not to mention everyone else under the age of 18, and yet we still vote. And people still admire the Constitution as some type of voluntary arrangement, even though the Constitution was a farce and was imposed by a group of people, and a majority of the people never had any say. So this idea that by voting causes governments to exist, I have to call bullshit. If you vote and you don't vote, either way, you're getting a state. Thanks.